Hey guys, tonight we're trading the mud and misery of centuries past for something that looks, on the surface, like the ultimate happy ending. A Hollywood movie star who married an actual prince and became a real, honest-to-goodness princess. Cue the doves, cue the tiara, cue the swelling fairy tale music. Except tonight we're slipping quietly behind the palace gates to find out what Grace Kelly's life was really like after the credits rolled. The confetti was swept up, and the happily ever after turned out to be a full-time job with no vacation days, a very strict dress code, and an entire country watching your every move. Before we begin, a sincere thank you to whoever dropped Grace Kelly into the suggestion box. You know who you are. And this one was a genuine pleasure to put together. Your ideas are honestly what keep this whole thing going, so if you're enjoying these, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always the middle of the night somewhere. The channel is now on Spotify too, so if you'd rather drift off with just the audio, the link is waiting for you down in the description, and if you ever need something even longer to sink into, there's an 8-hour ad-free version waiting for members. Perfect for those nights when sleep just won't come knocking. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white hush, and get comfortable. Let's pause for a moment and wonder a few things together. Have you ever imagined giving up the best job of your life, at the very peak of it, to move to a country smaller than most airports? Ever wondered what it's like to marry a man you'd technically met only a handful of times in front of 30 million strangers on live television? What do you do all day when your entire career suddenly becomes graceful in public forever? Could you smile through a state dinner in a language you were still learning, in shoes that don't fit, next to people who quietly resent you for being American? And what happens to a fairy tale once the cameras leave and you realise the castle has drafts, the prince has a temper, and the tiara, it turns out, is surprisingly heavy? Tonight we find out. So settle in, because the year is 1955. A young woman is about to step off a plane in the south of France for a photo shoot she almost skipped, and she has absolutely no idea that she's walking straight into the rest of her life. Everyone knows the version with the soft focus and the string section. Beautiful American actress meets handsome European prince, falls in love, sails across the ocean, marries in a cathedral, and lives out her days in a palace on a cliff above the glittering Mediterranean. It is one of the most repeated love stories of the 20th century, and like most fairy tales, it survives mainly because nobody bothered to check the fine print. Because the truth of what came after that wedding is far stranger, far lonelier, and far more human than the postcard. Grace Kelly did marry a prince. She did get the palace and the tiara and the cliff and the sea. What she did not get was a rehearsal, a manual, or any real say in the matter. Tonight we gently peel back the gold leaf to see what was actually underneath. Here is the thing about fairy tales. They always end at the wedding. The camera pulls back, the music swells, and everyone in the audience is allowed to assume that the rest is smooth sailing forever. Real life is inconvenient enough to keep going after the ceremony, and it keeps going in ways nobody puts in a storybook. Nobody writes the chapter about the drafty castle bedroom, or the language lessons, or the state dinner where your feet hurt, and you cannot understand half the jokes. Those parts get quietly left on the cutting room floor. And Grace's story had a great deal left on the floor. She was not a passive damsel who drifted dreamily into a happy ending. She was a sharp, disciplined, wildly successful professional woman who made a calculated leap into the single most restrictive job available to a human being in the modern age: full-time royalty. Imagine being the most in-demand person in your entire industry, at the exact peak of your powers, and then voluntarily accepting a role where your main duties are to look flawless, produce heirs, and never ever cause a scandal. It is a strange sort of promotion. You gain a crown and lose the ability to sneeze in public without it making the papers. The myth insists that she got everything she ever wanted. The reality is that she got a great many things she never asked for, alongside the things she did. She got beauty and wealth and a devoted public, yes. She also got homesickness, isolation, relentless scrutiny, a fragile little country that nearly collapsed on her watch, and a permanent audience that felt entitled to opinions about her waistline. Fairy tales do not mention the audience. Fairy tales assume the girl gets to stop performing once the prince shows up. Grace never got to stop. What makes her worth staying up for is precisely the gap between the postcard and the person. The world wanted a symbol, and she gave them one, flawlessly, for decades. But a symbol is a costume, and behind it was a real woman with real longings, a dry sense of humour, and a stubborn streak she inherited from a demanding family back in Philadelphia. Over the next several hours, we're going to walk through her actual life, the one that happened after the confetti was swept up. We are going to find the drafts in the castle, and the loneliness behind the smile, and the very real fight to keep her tiny kingdom on the map. So set aside the soft focus. The fairy tale, it turns out, was the least interesting thing that ever happened to her. Before she was anyone's princess, Grace Kelly was one of the most bankable, sought-after women in Hollywood, and she had gotten there with astonishing speed. In just a few short years, she had gone from a well-mannered girl out of Philadelphia to an Academy Award winner, sharing the screen with Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, and Cary Grant, and becoming the favourite leading lady of the director who trusted her most, Alfred Hitchcock. She was cool, poised, luminous, and crucially, at the very top of her profession. To understand the size of what she was about to give up, you first have to understand exactly how much she had. This was not a struggling actress looking for an exit. This was a woman walking away from a mountain she had only just finished climbing. Consider the trajectory. She came from money, the daughter of a self-made and famously demanding father who had built a fortune in bricklaying and treated his children like an Olympic training squad. She was expected to excel, and excelling was not optional in the Kelly household. When she chose acting, her family regarded it as roughly one notch above running off to join the circus. So she did what every stubborn overachiever does with a doubting parent. She got spectacularly good at it, and fast. Within a handful of years, she had gone from stage work and live television to the very centre of the film industry. She held her own opposite a weary Gary Cooper in a tense frontier standoff. She was menaced through a telephone in one Hitchcock thriller and confined to an apartment watching her neighbours through a window in another. She traded elegant, dangerous banter with Cary Grant on the French Riviera. And then she stripped away the glamour entirely to play an exhausted, embittered wife. And for that performance she won the Academy Award for Best Actress. In the language of the industry, she had a full trophy case before most people manage a decent starter shelf. She had also cultivated something rarer than talent, which was mystique. She was the definition of cool blonde poise, the woman who looked like she was keeping a delicious secret. Directors adored her. Audiences trusted her. The press could not get enough. In modern terms, she was the streaming platform's most valuable star, the name that got a film greenlit, the face on every magazine that mattered. If she had simply kept going, she could have coasted on that reputation for decades, which is what makes The Crossroads so remarkable. She was not being pushed out. There was no scandal, no flopped run of films, no fading appeal. She was at the summit, planting the flag, with the whole industry laid out below her, and she looked at all of it, and decided she might want something else entirely. Part of it was exhaustion with the machine, the contracts, the studio control over her life. Part of it was a longing she never fully advertised for stability, family, and a role that could not be recast the moment she turned 35. So when the offer of a lifetime arrived from an unexpected direction, it landed on a woman who was already, quietly, wondering whether the mountain she'd climbed was the one she actually wanted to live on. Most people spend their lives trying to reach the top of something. Grace got there early, looked around, and started thinking about the exit. The exit, as it turned out, wore a crown. The meeting that changed everything was, fittingly, a work assignment she nearly declined. In the spring of 1955, Grace was in the south of France for the Cannes Film Festival, when a magazine arranged for her to visit the Prince of Monaco at his palace for a photo shoot. The logistics were a small disaster. A wardrobe mishap, a power outage at her hotel, a long hot drive, and a prince who arrived late to greet her. It was hardly the stuff of legend. And yet somewhere between the awkward introductions and a tour of the palace gardens and its private zoo, something quietly took hold. Neither of them announced it. Neither of them perhaps fully understood it. But the machinery of a fairy tale had just been switched on, and it would not switch off again. The day itself read less like romance and more like a comedy of errors. There was a strike affecting the electricity at her hotel, which meant no working iron and no way to press her clothes into the crisp perfection the moment demanded. She ended up in a printed dress with a floral pattern, hardly the sleek statement she might have preferred for meeting royalty. Then came the drive up the coast to Monaco, in heat, on winding roads, on a tight schedule, which is the 1950s equivalent of your phone dying on the way to the most important interview of your life while stuck in traffic. She arrived. The prince did not. Rainier was running behind and Grace was left waiting, a movie star cooling her heels for a monarch she had never met, wondering, one imagines, why she had agreed to any of this. When he finally appeared, the encounter was polite, a little stiff, entirely proper. He showed her around. He walked her through the palace grounds and, in a detail that sounds invented but is perfectly true, introduced her to the animals in his private menagerie. Nothing about it screamed destiny. It screamed pleasant afternoon with a courteous stranger. But that is often how the enormous things begin, disguised as the ordinary. There was no fireworks display, no orchestra, no thunderclap. There was a quiet, well-mannered mutual interest, the kind that does not make for good cinema, but makes for the real beginnings of real relationships. He was serious and reserved, a man who had grown up as the ruler of a tiny state and carried it in his posture. She was gracious and observant, trained by a lifetime of scrutiny to read a room instantly. They were, in their own careful ways, sizing each other up. What neither of them could see was the scale of what they were starting. To Grace, it was a photo shoot and a courtesy call, an odd little detour in a busy festival week. To history, it was the first scene of one of the most watched partnerships of the century. The photographs from that day would soon look, in hindsight, absurdly significant. Two people standing together with no idea that the entire future was already leaning in. They parted without drama. She went back to her life of premieres and cameras and contracts. He went back to his palace and his responsibilities, and his very pressing need to secure the future of his dynasty. And then the letters began, crossing the Atlantic, patient and formal at first, building towards something that neither the strike nor the heat nor the wilted dress nor the tardy prince had managed to prevent. Sometimes the most consequential day of your life shows up looking exactly like a bad one. What followed was less a whirlwind romance than a whirlwind negotiation. After a correspondence conducted largely by letter, Prince Rainier travelled to the United States that winter, spent a matter of days in Grace's company, met her family, and proposed. It was romantic, certainly, but it was also a transaction, and not a small one. Monaco was a principality that needed an heir, an image, and a fresh reason for the world to pay attention, and Grace fit all three needs perfectly. There was, famously, the delicate matter of a dowry, a detail that tends to get quietly edited out of the storybook. Love was real. So was the ledger. In the marriage of a movie star and a monarch, the two were never quite allowed to sit at separate tables. The letters had done their work across the ocean, the way slow correspondence once did before anyone could text a heart emoji at midnight. By the time Rainier arrived in America around the Christmas season of 1955, the two had built something real out of ink and paper and distance. But the actual in-person courtship, the part where they confirmed they wanted to spend their lives together, was breathtakingly brief. They had spent only a small handful of days in each other's physical company before he proposed. By modern standards, this is roughly the equivalent of getting engaged to someone after 3 good dates and a very long text thread. And then he met the family, which meant meeting Jack Kelly, Grace's formidable father, a man not easily impressed by anyone, prince or otherwise. The Kellys were wealthy, proud, and thoroughly self-made, and they were not about to be dazzled simply because a title had walked through the door. This is where the storybook gets awkward, because securing the marriage involved money changing hands. A dowry was expected, a substantial sum, and the negotiations around it were businesslike in a way that fairy tales strenuously avoid mentioning. Somewhere in the romance was a spreadsheet. None of this means the affection was fake. By all accounts, it was genuine. But it existed inside a machine of obligation, and the machine had requirements. Monaco was not merely acquiring a beautiful bride. It was acquiring the most famous face in the world, a public relations triumph beyond calculation, at a moment when the principality badly needed to remind everyone it existed. And Rainier personally needed something even more fundamental than glamour. He needed an heir. This was the fine print that mattered most. Under the terms of Monaco's arrangement with France, if Rainier died without a legitimate heir, the principality risked losing its sovereignty and its special status. In plain language, the survival of the entire country was tied to whether the prince produced a child. So the marriage was, among all its romance, a dynastic necessity. Grace was not just being asked to be a wife. She was being asked to guarantee the future of a nation biologically on a deadline. She said yes anyway, eyes open, sharp as ever, fully aware that she was signing on to more than a husband. The engagement was announced and the world lost its collective mind. An American movie star and a European prince. It was too perfect, too cinematic, too marketable to be anything but a global sensation. The press pounced. The public swooned. The publicity machine on both sides of the ocean roared to life. The wedding of the century was officially on the calendar. All it had cost so far was a dowry, a career, and any lingering illusion that royalty marries purely for love. To become Princess of Monaco, Grace had to stop being Grace Kelly the movie star, and the terms were absolute. There would be no more films. Her studio, MGM, still had her under contract, and the untangling of that was its own small drama. But the larger truth was harsher and simpler. The woman who had just won an Oscar was retiring from acting at 26, at the height of her powers, and she was not coming back. Her final film wrapped, her belongings were packed, and an entire future she had built for herself was gently folded away and set on a shelf. She would spend the rest of her life being watched by more people than any film could ever reach. She would also never again be handed a script that let her be someone other than herself. The math of it is staggering when you sit with it. Most actors would give a limb for the position she occupied. She had the awards, the offers, the mystique, the peak years still ahead of her, and she walked away from all of it before her 27th birthday. In modern terms, picture the most acclaimed performer of the moment announcing retirement the same year they won their first major award and never appearing on screen again. It would break the internet. In 1956, it simply broke 1,000 hearts across Hollywood. There was the practical business of the studio to deal with, of course. Studios in that era owned their stars in a way that seems almost feudal now, controlling their films, their images, their public lives. MGM did not simply wave goodbye and wish her well, but the studio was also nothing if not shrewd, and it found a way to profit from the fairy tale, securing the rights to film the wedding itself. If they were losing their brightest star to a throne, they would at least get a spectacular final production out of her, one where she did not even have to act. Her last completed film was a glittering musical romp, filmed before the wedding and released after, so that audiences got to watch her one final time on screen, even as she was already becoming a princess in real life. It was a strange sort of overlap, the actress and the royal existing simultaneously for a brief window, the past and the future briefly sharing the same face, and then the past closed for good. What she was actually surrendering went deeper than fame or money. Acting had been her rebellion, her achievement, the thing she had fought her doubting family to pursue, and then conquered on her own terms. It was the proof that she was more than a wealthy man's daughter. Giving it up meant giving up the one arena where she'd been fully, undeniably in charge of who she got to be. On screen, she could be a thief, a saint, a wife, a schemer, a heroine. She could try on entire lives and hand them back. Now she would have exactly one role for the rest of her life, with no rap date and no possibility of recasting. Princess of Monaco. Performed 24 hours a day in front of the largest and least forgiving audience imaginable, with the harshest critics being the ones who claimed to love her most. She closed the door on Hollywood with the same composure she brought to everything, but it was a door that, once shut, would not open again, no matter how badly in certain lonely years to come she would wish it might. Some people retire from their dream job. Grace exchanged hers for a crown and never got to find out which she would have preferred. There were, in fact, 2 weddings, because a union this consequential could not be trusted to a single ceremony. The first was the civil wedding, held inside the palace in April of 1956, a legally binding affair conducted in French, with a reading of dozens of the couple's new titles. Grace, who was still learning the language, sat through a recitation of honours and territories that now belonged to her, most of which she'd never heard of that morning. It was solemn, it was official, and it was, by most accounts, faintly overwhelming. She was no longer merely marrying a man. She was being formally installed into a role, a house and a country, one carefully worded clause at a time. The setting was the throne room of the palace, all gilded splendour and centuries of accumulated grandeur, the kind of room that makes ordinary furniture feel embarrassed. This was the wedding that actually counted in the eyes of the law, the paperwork made ceremonial, the moment Monaco officially acquired its new princess. And because it was Monaco, and because it was royalty, nothing about it was simple. Where an ordinary couple signs a marriage license and maybe grabs lunch, Grace sat through an elaborate legal ritual conducted entirely in a language she was still, quite literally, taking lessons in. Imagine the strangeness of it. A judge, or the official presiding, reads aloud the vast catalogue of titles that now attach themselves to you. Duchess of this, Marchioness of that, Countess of somewhere you could not locate on a map if your life depended on it. On this single day, Grace Kelly of Philadelphia accumulated more than 100 titles, an avalanche of nobility descending on a woman who, a year earlier, had been reading movie scripts in California. It was less like a wedding and more like being handed the keys to a very old, very complicated inheritance while everyone watched to see if you would drop them. She did not drop them. Composure was her native tongue, even when French was not. She sat with perfect poise through the recitation, absorbing the weight of a new identity being layered onto her clause by clause. But the sheer administrative enormity of it must have been surreal. Most brides worry about the flowers and the seating chart. Grace was being legally merged into a 700-year-old dynasty in front of officials, family, and the ever-present cameras. And the cameras were always present now. Even this comparatively private legal ceremony was a matter of intense global interest, documented and photographed, because the world had decided this wedding belonged to everyone. There is a particular kind of pressure in having your most personal moments treated as public property, and Grace was getting an early, thorough lesson in it. Her marriage was not merely hers, it was Monaco's, the press's, the public's, a shared possession she happened to be standing in the middle of. By the end of the civil ceremony, the thing was done in the eyes of the state. Legally, officially on paper, she was the wife of the sovereign prince and a princess of the realm. It should have felt like an ending, the moment the story completed itself. Instead, it felt like the first day at an overwhelming new job, one where the orientation was conducted in a foreign language and the employee handbook was written in the 13th century. And she was not even finished, because a wedding this legally binding still needed something the paperwork could not provide, a spectacle grand enough for 30 million witnesses. The lawyers had had their turn. Tomorrow belonged to the cathedral, the cameras, and the dress. The next day came the ceremony the world actually remembers, the religious wedding at the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, watched by an estimated 30 million people on live television, an audience unheard of for the era. The dress alone became legend, a creation of lace and silk and quiet perfection, designed by the studio that had once employed her. Royalty, celebrities, and dignitaries filled the cathedral. Photographers filled everything else. It was staged with the precision of a film premiere and the weight of a coronation, and at the centre of it stood a young woman doing something almost impossible, getting married, in private, in front of the entire planet. When it was over, Grace Kelly stepped out of the cathedral no longer an actress at all, but a princess, and there was no take two. The dress deserves its own moment, because it has never really stopped being famous. It was created by the costume designers at her old studio, a parting gift of sorts, and it was a masterpiece of restraint and craft, built from yards of antique lace, silk, and delicate detail. It was demure and regal and flawless, and it would go on to influence bridal fashion for generations, quietly copied by countless brides who had no idea they were echoing a princess. When people picture the perfect wedding dress, some part of that mental image traces straight back to this morning in Monaco. The television broadcast was, for its time, almost incomprehensible in scale. 30 million people tuned in to watch, an audience that dwarfed nearly anything television had attempted. Europe stopped. Much of America stopped. People who had never given a thought to a tiny principality on the Mediterranean suddenly cared intensely about its royal wedding. In an age before satellites made global broadcasts routine, this was a genuine technological and cultural event, the closest thing the 1950s had to the entire world staring at the same screen at the same time. Inside the cathedral, the guest list read like a collision of two universes. European royalty and nobility sat among Hollywood stars and international dignitaries, the old world and the new world crammed into the same pews, all of them there to witness the marriage that had merged those two worlds into one. It was a room full of the most photographed people on earth, and every single one of them was for once in the audience rather than at the centre of it. And through all of it, Grace performed the one role she could never rehearse enough: herself, getting married. calmly, gracefully, while an ocean of strangers watched her make the most intimate vow a person can make. There is a peculiar cruelty in that. A wedding is supposed to be the day you belong most completely to one other person. Hers belonged to 30 million people she would never meet. She promised her life to Rainier while functionally standing on the largest stage ever assembled, unable to have a single unobserved moment. She did it beautifully. Of course she did. Poise under pressure was the skill she'd spent her whole career perfecting, and never had it been more thoroughly tested. She said her vows, she wore the legendary dress, she embodied every ounce of the fairy tale the world had ordered. Then she walked out of that cathedral into the rest of her life, and the fairy tale, as far as the public was concerned, was complete. The prince had his princess. The story had its ending. Except it was not an ending at all. The cameras would eventually pack up and leave, and Grace would remain in a palace on a rock at the start of the part of the story nobody had filmed. After the honeymoon at sea, Grace arrived to begin her actual life in Monaco, and this is where the fairy tale quietly changes texture. Monaco was beautiful, yes, all sun and stone and sea, but it was also tiny, insular, and deeply set in its ways. The palace perched on a fortified outcrop the locals simply called the Rock, and inside it waited a household of staff, a calendar of duties, and a court that had been running long before she got there. There was no easing in period. The cameras that had followed the wedding did not leave. From her very first days she was expected to be flawless, gracious, and endlessly on display, in a place where she knew almost no one, and where everyone already had firm opinions about her. The honeymoon itself had been a long Mediterranean cruise aboard the prince's yacht, a floating interlude of relative privacy before reality set in. But even that was watched, followed by curious boats and hungry photographers, a preview of the surveillance that would define the years ahead. Eventually the cruise ended, as all honeymoons do, and the yacht delivered her to her new home, and the vacation part of the fairy tale was decisively over. The palace on the rock was undeniably magnificent, a fortress-turned residence built up over centuries, sitting high above the harbour with views that would stop anyone's heart. But magnificence and comfort are not the same thing, as anyone who has ever lived in a grand old building knows. Ancient palaces are draughty, echoing and stubborn. They are staffed by people who have their own long-established ways of doing everything, and those people were now, in a sense, both her servants and her judges, watching to see whether the American girl measured up. That was the part no honeymoon could soften. She was walking into an existing institution, a court with its own hierarchy, customs, rivalries and expectations, all of it in place long before she arrived. She was the newcomer, the outsider, the foreigner who had swept in and married the prince, and not everyone was delighted about it. There were people who quietly doubted her, who wondered whether a Hollywood actress could possibly understand the dignity of the role, who measured every gesture against some invisible standard of how a proper princess ought to behave, and she had to win them over while learning, in real time, an entirely new life. There was no gentle onboarding, no probationary period where mistakes were forgiven. From day one she was the Princess of Monaco, and the country, the court, and the world were all watching to see how she would wear it. The pressure to be perfect was immediate and total. A wrong word, an ungraceful moment, a flash of the homesickness she surely felt, any of it could become a story, a doubt, a crack in the image. So she did what she'd always done. She studied. She observed. She applied that famous discipline to the enormous task of becoming who this place needed her to be. She learned the rhythms of the palace, the names, the duties, the expectations, absorbing it all with the quiet intensity of someone who had never once been allowed to fail in front of an audience. but underneath the composure, she was very far from home, on a rock in the sea, surrounded by strangers, married into a life she was only beginning to understand. The confetti was swept up, the cameras were still there, and the real work of being a princess, the unglamorous, relentless, lonely work, was just getting started. Welcome to the Rock. The view was spectacular. The walls were very, very old. To grasp Grace's new world, you have to grasp just how small her new kingdom really was. Monaco was, and remains, one of the tiniest sovereign states on earth. A sliver of coastline you could stroll across in an afternoon, famous chiefly for two things, its casino and its wealthy visitors. Its fortunes had long risen and fallen with the roulette wheels of Monte Carlo. This was the realm Grace now presided over, a glamorous little principality that lived on tourism, tax advantages and reputation. For a woman who'd grown up in a large American city and worked in the vast machinery of Hollywood, the scale of it all could feel less like a kingdom and more like a very ornate, very watched small town where she happened to be the main attraction. The numbers are almost comical. Monaco is so small that it would fit, with room to spare, inside a single large city park. It is the sort of country you can walk end to end before lunch and still have time to sit down and complain about your feet. There are neighbourhoods in ordinary cities that cover more ground, and yet this tiny sliver of land was a fully sovereign state, with its own ruler, its own traditions, and its own fierce sense of independence, punching so far above its weight that the whole world had just watched its royal wedding. Its wealth came not from farms or factories, because there was no room for either, but from something far more glamorous and far more precarious, the casino. Monte Carlo had built its fortune on gambling, luxury, and the steady stream of rich visitors who came to lose money elegantly beneath the chandeliers. The company that ran the casino and much of the principality's business was effectively the beating financial heart of the state. In practical terms, Grace had married into a country whose economy ran on roulette wheels and the enduring willingness of the wealthy to be parted from their money in style. This gave the whole place a curious double character. On the surface, it was pure enchantment. Yachts in the harbour, sun on the water, the perfumed glamour of the very rich at play. Underneath, it was a small, exposed enterprise, dependent on image, tourism, and the goodwill of far larger neighbours to survive. Its glamour was not decoration. Its glamour was the entire business model. If Monaco ever stopped seeming magical, it would stop being profitable, and if it stopped being profitable, it would be in serious trouble, which is precisely where Grace came in, whether she had fully realised it or not. She was not just a wife and a princess. She was the single most valuable piece of publicity the principality had ever acquired. Her face, her fame, her fairy tale story, all of it drew the eyes of the world to a place that lived and died by attention. In marrying her, Monaco had essentially hired the most famous spokesperson on the planet, and her job, in part, was simply to exist beautifully and keep the whole glittering enterprise glamorous enough to stay in business. For Grace, the intimacy of the scale must have been jarring. In Hollywood, she'd been one bright star in an enormous constellation. Here, she was the sun around which a very small world orbited. Everyone knew her. Everyone watched her. There was no anonymity to be found in a place this compact, no crowd large enough to disappear into. She was the main attraction in a kingdom you could cross on foot. It was in the end a very grand life lived in a very small space, and small spaces, as she would learn, have a way of closing in. Grace had not simply married a man, she had married a dynasty, and one of the oldest in Europe. The House of Grimaldi had ruled Monaco for roughly 7 centuries, a family whose history was a tangle of clever alliances, narrow escapes, and stubborn survival against much larger neighbours. To join it was to inherit not just a title, but a lineage, a set of expectations, and a long list of ghosts. There were traditions she was expected to honour without question, and a family reputation she was now personally responsible for upholding. The Grimaldis had endured for hundreds of years precisely by taking their own continuation very seriously. Grace, the newcomer from across the ocean, was expected to help ensure the line continued, and to do it with a smile. The origin story of the dynasty is the sort of thing you could not put in a film without someone accusing you of overdoing it. Centuries earlier, the family had seized control of the rock through a legendary act of disguise and daring, a founder slipping past the defences dressed as a humble monk before drawing a blade. That founding trick was so central to the family identity that it was stitched into the very coat of arms, 2 monks brandishing swords, a permanent reminder that this dynasty began with audacity and never quite lost the taste for it. Grace was marrying into a family whose official emblem was essentially a warning. 700 years is an almost unfathomable stretch of continuity. To put it in perspective, the Grimaldis had been ruling their tiny rock since long before most of the world's current nations existed in any recognisable form. They had watched empires rise and collapse, survived wars and revolutions, been threatened, occupied, restored, and threatened again, and somehow always clawed their way back to sovereignty over their little patch of coastline. Endurance was not just their history, it was their entire brand. Marrying into that meant absorbing an enormous weight of expectation. Grace was not the beginning of anything. She was the newest link in a chain that stretched back through the fog of medieval history, and everyone around her was acutely aware of the difference between a genuine Grimaldi and an American actress who had recently joined the family. She was expected to understand the traditions, respect the protocols, and behave in a manner worthy of a lineage that predated her homeland by centuries. The bar was not merely high. The bar had been set in the Middle Ages, and the survival of the dynasty rested quite literally on the next generation, which made Grace's role uncomfortably specific. This was a family that had endured by never failing to produce an heir at the crucial moment. The entire 700-year story could, in theory, come apart if the line was not continued, and continuing the line was now her responsibility. She had married into living history, and history was watching to see whether she would keep it going. There was pressure in that, obviously, but also a strange grandeur. She had gone from being the daughter of a self-made American businessman to being the guardian of one of Europe's most ancient royal houses. The girl whose family had once regarded acting as barely respectable was now personally entrusted with the future of a dynasty older than most countries. Even her demanding father would have struggled to top that. But dynasties do not care about your feelings, and they do not offer sabbaticals. They care about continuity, dignity, and the production of the next generation. Grace understood the assignment. She had married the man, yes, but she had also signed on to 7 centuries of survival, and the Grimaldis had never been in the habit of letting the story end. The next chapter of it, they made clear, would be written in the nursery. The prince's palace was magnificent, and it was also, in the plain daily sense, her home now, which meant learning to live inside a monument. There were centuries-old rooms, priceless furnishings, and corridors staffed by people whose job was to observe protocol at all hours. Privacy, the ordinary kind most people take for granted, became a scarce commodity. Meals were formal, schedules were managed. Even leisure had a shape and an audience. Grace, ever practical and quietly determined, set about making pockets of the place feel genuinely lived in, softening the grandeur where she could. But a palace is not a house, and she would spend years negotiating the strange gap between owning one of the most beautiful residences in the world and simply wanting somewhere to feel at ease. The trouble with living in a monument is that it was never designed for living. It was designed for impressing, for enduring, for reminding everyone who entered exactly how old and important the family inside it was. The rooms were vast and echoing, the ceilings distant, the furniture the kind you admire rather than actually use. It was less a home than a very grand museum where the exhibits happen to include your own bed. Curling up somewhere cosy with a book is a challenge when the nearest chair is a 300-year-old antique that predates the concept of comfort. Then there was the staff, everywhere, always, silent and attentive. A palace runs on an army of people, and every one of them had a role, a routine, and a quiet awareness of everything that happened inside those walls. For Grace, this meant she was essentially never alone. Someone was always nearby, ready to serve, to observe, to notice. It is the sort of thing that sounds luxurious until you imagine trying to have a private argument, a good cry, or simply a lazy morning without an audience of professionals hovering just out of frame. Protocol governed the rhythm of the days in ways that would exhaust anyone raised on ordinary freedom. Meals were formal occasions with their own rules. Schedules were planned and managed. There were correct ways to do nearly everything, ways that had been established long before she arrived and would not be bending to accommodate American habits. Even relaxation, the one thing that is supposed to be unstructured, came with expectations. In a palace, there is a right way to have leisure, and someone is keeping track. Grace, being Grace, did not simply surrender to the museum. She went to work on it, the way she went to work on every challenge, with quiet, stubborn determination. She carved out pockets of warmth where she could, personalizing corners of the vast residence, trying to coax something homelike out of all that formal splendor. If she could not change the fundamental nature of the place, she could at least plant small flags of ordinary human comfort within it. A room here, a routine there, that felt like hers rather than the dynasty's. But the gap never fully closed. She owned one of the most beautiful homes on earth and spent years wishing in the ordinary human way for somewhere she could simply exhale. It is one of the quieter ironies of her life that a woman with a palace often longed for nothing grander than a genuinely private moment. The grandeur was real. So was the loneliness that grandeur can breed. Living inside the monument was only half the challenge, though. The other half was learning to belong to it, to move through this ancient world as if she'd been born into it, and that meant a reinvention more total than any role she'd ever played. Perhaps the hardest work of Grace's early princess years was invisible, the sheer labour of reinventing herself into someone the role demanded. She threw herself into learning French, studying the customs of her adopted court, memorising the etiquette, the histories, the endless names and hierarchies. She'd been a professional at becoming other people on screen, and now she applied that same discipline to the most demanding part of her life. But this was a role with no ending and no director calling cut. Every gesture was scrutinised for correctness, every misstep quietly noted. Slowly, painstakingly, the American movie star learned to move through European royalty as if she'd been born to it, an act of will that looked, to the watching world, entirely effortless. Start with the language, because that alone was a mountain. French was the language of her new court, her new country, her husband's world, and she arrived not remotely fluent. She had to learn it, properly, well enough to conduct conversations, receive dignitaries, and get through formal occasions without stumbling. Anyone who has ever tried to learn a language as an adult knows the particular humiliation of it. The moment your quick, confident personality gets trapped behind a vocabulary the size of a child's. Now imagine doing that in public, as a princess, with the world assuming you should already be perfect. Then came the etiquette, an entire invisible rulebook governing how royalty moves, speaks, greets, dines, and behaves. There were correct forms of address for everyone. hierarchies to memorize, customs with roots reaching back centuries, who bows to whom, who is greeted first, which fork, which title, which precise degree of warmth for which precise rank of visitor. It is a system so elaborate that people are born into it and still get it wrong, and Grace was not born into it. She had to learn the whole thing from scratch, as an adult, under scrutiny, with no margin for error. And she brought to this the one advantage her old life had given her. She was a trained professional at becoming other people. Acting is, at its core, the disciplined study of how to convincingly be someone you are not, and Grace had been very, very good at it. She turned that skill on her own life. She studied her new role the way she had once studied scripts, absorbing the mannerisms, the protocols, the bearing, until she could perform Princess as flawlessly as she had once performed any character. The cruel difference, of course, was that a film ends. A role you play on screen releases you the moment the director calls cut, and you go home and become yourself again. This role had no cut, no wrap party, no going home to be Grace. She was on, permanently, in a performance with no intermission. Every gesture was observed and judged. Every small slip, a wrong word, an incorrect form, a flash of the girl from Philadelphia could become a whispered story about the American who did not quite fit. So she never slipped, or at least never let it show. Bit by painstaking bit, she became fluent in Princess, mastering the language and the customs and the bearing, until she glided through the most rarefied circles of European royalty as though she had always belonged there. The watching world saw only effortless grace, which was, of course, the entire point. Nobody was supposed to see the labour. The whole triumph was making the impossible look easy. But behind the seamless performance was a marriage to a real and complicated man, and no amount of protocol could teach her how to navigate that. At the centre of it all was Rainier himself, the husband whose world she'd entered, and their marriage was more complicated than the wedding footage suggested. He was serious, private, and accustomed to being obeyed, a man shaped by rule and responsibility. Grace was warm, sociable, and used to a different kind of freedom. They shared genuine affection and a real partnership, but they were also two strong people fitting themselves into a union that carried the weight of a nation. There were tensions, adjustments, and the ordinary friction of any marriage, amplified by the fact that theirs was never truly private. Behind the official portraits was the far more relatable story of two people trying, with mixed success, to actually understand each other. Rainier had been ruling since he was a young man, and rulers develop certain habits. He was used to being the final word, the one whose decision stood, the centre of gravity in every room he entered. This is not a criticism so much as an occupational reality. Spend your formative years as the sovereign of a state, and you do not tend to grow up into a person who takes suggestions gracefully. He was serious by nature, guarded with his feelings, and protective to the point of control over the world he governed, which now included his wife. Grace was, in many ways, his opposite. She was warm and socially fluent, at ease with people, shaped by the collaborative, expressive world of film. She'd spent her career surrounded by big personalities and had learned to hold her own among them. She was also, beneath the poise, independent-minded, a woman who had defied her family to build a career and then walked away from it on her own terms. That is not the resume of someone who slots easily into a supporting role. So you had two strong-willed people, from two very different worlds, trying to build a single life together, with the added complication that their marriage was also a matter of state. Their union was not merely personal, it was symbolic, dynastic, and permanently on display, which meant that the ordinary give and take of any marriage had to happen inside a fishbowl, with a nation watching, and a public that had bought so completely into the fairy tale that it could not tolerate a single crack in it. There was real affection between them. That much comes through in the record, in the partnership they built and the family they raised and the decades they stayed together. But affection is not the same as ease, and their marriage had its tensions, its adjustments, its stretches of friction, exactly as any real marriage does. The difference was that they could never simply have an ordinary bad week. Every strain carried the extra weight of expectation, the sense that the most famous couple in the world was not permitted the normal frustrations of two people sharing a home. It is, in the end, one of the most relatable parts of her story, buried under all the crowns and cameras. Strip away the palace and you have something almost universal. Two people who loved each other, in their fashion, working hard to understand each other across a real gap of temperament and background, not always succeeding, always trying. The fairy tale sold a flawless romance. The reality was a genuine marriage, complicated and human, between a controlling prince and an independent woman who had given up everything to be there. And that marriage was about to be tested not just by the ordinary friction of two personalities, but by a man from the outside who wanted to control the very country they lived in. Grace had also married into a very specific power struggle, one that had little to do with romance and everything to do with control of Monaco itself. The Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis had spent years quietly buying up a controlling stake in the company that effectively ran Monte Carlo's casino and much of the principality's business, and he had his own vision for the little state's future. This put him on a slow collision course with Rainier, who had no intention of being a figurehead in his own country. Grace found herself living inside a boardroom battle dressed up as high society, where dinner guests might also be rivals, and where the glamour of Monaco masked a very real fight over who would truly hold the reins. The setup was almost absurd when you look at it plainly. There was a company, an old and powerful one, that controlled the casino, the grand hotels, and a huge slice of everything that made Monaco function financially. And one of the richest men in the world had quietly bought enough of it to become, in effect, the majority owner, which meant that a private individual, a foreign shipping tycoon with a taste for grandeur, held enormous sway over the economic engine of a sovereign prince's country. It was as if someone had walked in and purchased a controlling interest in your entire kingdom while you were busy running it. Onassis had a vision for Monaco, and it was not necessarily Rainier's vision. The magnate favoured keeping the place exclusive, a discreet playground for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of glittering, rarefied enclave where old money felt at home. Rainier, on the other hand, understood that a country cannot survive forever on a shrinking pool of aristocrats and casino regulars. He wanted to modernise, to expand tourism, to broaden Monaco's appeal and secure its future on firmer ground than the whims of the very rich. 2 men, 2 visions, 1 very small country, and no room for both to win. The result was a slow, simmering power struggle conducted with the exquisite politeness of high society. This was not a war fought with armies. It was fought at dinner parties, in board meetings, in the careful manoeuvring of shares and influence. The people circling the same glamorous social events were, beneath the pleasantries, locked in a contest over who would actually control the destiny of the state. Grace lived in the middle of this, hosting and attending and smiling, fully aware that some of the elegant guests were in truth her husband's adversaries. Rainier, to his credit, refused to be reduced to a figurehead in his own realm. A prince who does not control his own country is a prince in name only, a decorative monarch presiding over someone else's decisions, and he was not willing to accept that fate. So he set about reclaiming control, and he did it with patience and cunning, ultimately manoeuvring to dilute the tycoon's grip on the company by having the state issue new shares, shifting the balance of power decisively back toward the crown. Over time, the magnate's dominance was broken, and control of Monaco's economic heart returned to where Rainier believed it belonged. For Grace, it was an early and vivid lesson in the reality beneath the glamour. Her fairy tale kingdom was also a business, and a contested one, where power was real, stakes were high, and the beautiful surface concealed a hard-nosed fight for control. The tiara was lovely, but somebody still had to own the casino. And while that battle played out in boardrooms, the most important question of all was being asked in the nursery. If there was one duty that towered above all others, it was the production of an heir, and the pressure on Grace to deliver one began almost immediately. In early 1957, less than a year into the marriage, she gave birth to a daughter, Caroline, to enormous public celebration. It was joyful, and it was also, in the cold arithmetic of succession, not quite the finish line. A daughter was cherished, but the rules of the Grimaldi line still leaned heavily toward a son. So even in the happiness of new motherhood, the quiet clock kept ticking, and Grace understood better than anyone that a princess's most closely watched work was not yet done. The speed of it tells you everything about the expectations. Less than a year after the wedding, the new princess was already delivering the next generation. There was no leisurely settling-in period, no relaxed few years of being newlyweds before thinking about children. The dynasty needed continuity, and it needed it promptly, and Grace's body had become, in a sense, a matter of national interest. It is a deeply strange thing to contemplate, that the arrival of your first child is weighted not just by your family, but by an entire country, checking anxiously for news. When Caroline was born, the celebration was genuine and enormous. A child had arrived in the palace, the family had grown, the fairy tale had produced its first sequel. Monaco rejoiced, the world cooed, and Grace experienced the real, overwhelming joy of becoming a mother for the first time. On every human level, it was a triumph and a blessing, a healthy daughter born to a couple the whole planet was rooting for. But dynasties do not run on human levels. They run on rules, and the rules of succession in this ancient house lean toward male heirs. A daughter was adored, treasured, celebrated, and yet in the cold logic of the line, she did not fully resolve the question that had hung over the marriage from the beginning. The succession was not yet secure. The country still needed a son to feel truly safe about its future, and everyone knew it, which meant that even amid the delight of a new baby, the pressure did not lift. It simply paused. Imagine the peculiar cruelty of that. You have just given birth. You are flooded with love and exhaustion and joy, and hovering at the edge of the celebration is the unspoken awareness that the job is not finished. The clock, briefly quiet, starts ticking again. There is more expected. The most private and profound experience of your life is also, simultaneously, a partial fulfillment of a public obligation, applauded but not quite complete. Grace, sharp and clear-eyed as always, understood this perfectly. She knew that her most scrutinized work as a princess was not diplomacy or charity or fashion. It was this. The continuation of a 700-year line rested on what happened in the nursery, and a daughter, however beloved, had not closed the case. She had done something wonderful and something enormous, and it still was not, by the brutal standard of dynastic necessity, quite enough. So she carried the joy of Caroline alongside the knowledge that the country was still waiting, still hoping, still counting on her for the one thing that would finally settle the future. The finish line was in sight, but she'd not yet crossed it. She would cross it the following year, and when she did, the cannons would tell the whole world. The following year, in 1958, Grace gave birth to a son, Albert, and with him came a peculiar kind of relief that rippled through the entire principality. The succession was secured, the dynasty had its future, cannons were fired, and the country exhaled. For Grace, it was both a personal joy and the fulfillment of the single most important expectation placed upon her. In 2 years she had married into a royal house, learned its language and customs, and provided both a daughter and the crucial male heir. By almost any measure, she had triumphantly done everything asked of her. The strange part, and the human part, was discovering that having met every expectation did not automatically make her happy. The cannons were not a metaphor. Monaco genuinely marked the birth of a male heir with an artillery salute, a thunderous public announcement fired across the harbour to tell everyone within earshot that the future of the dynasty was now safe. A daughter, the year before, had been celebrated warmly. A son was celebrated with gunpowder. The difference in decibels tells you precisely how the old rules weighted the two events, and Grace, lying in the palace with her newborn boy, would have heard exactly what that thunder meant. For the country, it was pure relief. The anxious question that had hovered over the marriage from its earliest negotiations, the one tied to treaties and sovereignty, and the very survival of Monaco as an independent state, was finally answered. There was a son. The line would continue. The nightmare scenario of a dynasty ending and a country losing its special status had been averted, and the entire principality could breathe out at last. In 2 short years, Grace had delivered not just children but the security of a nation. And it was genuinely a joy for her as well. This was her son, her second child, a healthy baby born into a growing family she loved. The personal happiness was real, layered right on top of the public triumph. She had done it. She had accomplished with remarkable speed and grace the most important task assigned to her, the one everything else had been building toward. Step back and survey what she had pulled off in just 2 years, and it is genuinely staggering. She had married into one of Europe's oldest royal houses. She had learned a new language and mastered a dizzyingly complex code of court etiquette. She had transformed herself from Hollywood actress into flawless princess. And she had produced both a cherished daughter and the all-important male heir who secured the throne. By every external measure, she was an unqualified, spectacular success. If being a princess came with performance reviews, hers would have been perfect, which is exactly where the human truth gets complicated. Because meeting every expectation, ticking every box, triumphing at every assigned task, did not deliver the contentment the fairy tale had promised. She'd done everything right and discovered the quiet, disorienting fact that doing everything right is not the same as being happy. The applause faded. The cannons went silent. And underneath the successful princess was still a woman, far from home, in a gilded life she'd chosen but didn't always love. That gap between the flawless performance and the private feeling is where the real Grace lived. She had secured the throne, delighted a nation, and fulfilled her destiny. And she was about to learn that the fairy tale kingdom she'd done so much to serve could nearly vanish overnight, taking all that hard-won security with it. In 1962, Grace's storybook kingdom nearly ceased to exist, and the threat came not from within, but from its enormous neighbour. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, grew frustrated with Monaco's status as a tax haven, where French citizens and companies sheltered their fortunes, and applied ferocious pressure, even threatening a blockade of the tiny state. Suddenly, the principality Grace had married into was in a genuine standoff with one of the great powers of Europe. It was a tense, frightening chapter that stripped away the glamour entirely and revealed the vulnerable little country underneath. For Grace, it was a stark reminder that her fairy tale realm was, in the end, a real and fragile place whose very survival could not be taken for granted. The root of it was money, as these things usually are. Monaco had long offered a very attractive proposition to the wealthy. Come here and pay little or nothing in the taxes you would owe elsewhere. This was marvellous for Monaco and its glamorous reputation, but rather less marvellous for France, which watched its own rich citizens and businesses quietly relocating their fortunes across the border into the tiny principality to avoid the French taxman. For a large, proud nation, having a miniature neighbour function as an escape hatch for your wealthiest taxpayers is understandably irritating, and France in this era was led by Charles de Gaulle, a towering, formidable figure not known for patience or for backing down. He decided the arrangement had gone on long enough, and he brought the full weight of French pressure to bear on Monaco. This was not a polite diplomatic disagreement. France went so far as to threaten drastic measures, including the possibility of effectively sealing off the principality, a genuine blockade of the little state that was almost entirely surrounded by French territory. Monaco, remember, is a sliver of coastline hemmed in on all sides. A determined France could squeeze it like a hand closing around a marble. The imbalance was almost comic in its extremity. On one side, France, a major world power with a vast military economy and population. On the other, Monaco, a country you could stroll across before lunch, with a prince, a casino, and a great deal of charm. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a heavyweight champion menacing a particularly well-dressed toddler. And yet, the toddler's entire independent existence was genuinely on the line. For a period, the tension was real and frightening. This was not the glamorous Monaco of yacht harbours and gala evenings. This was Monaco exposed, small and vulnerable, staring down a neighbour with the power to strangle it. The fairy tale glitter fell away completely, revealing the hard truth underneath. That sovereignty for a state this size is a delicate, negotiated thing, dependent on the goodwill of the giants next door, and that goodwill had just evaporated. Eventually, as these confrontations tend to, it resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than catastrophe. Arrangements were reached, adjustments made, and Monaco survived with its independence intact, if somewhat chastened. The crisis passed, but it left a mark. For Grace, watching her husband's country teeter on the edge of being swallowed whole, it was a sobering education. She'd married into what looked like an eternal fairy tale kingdom, and discovered that it was, in fact, a fragile little state whose survival could be threatened by a stroke of a powerful neighbour's pen. The palace, the crown, the ancient dynasty, all of it rested on ground far less solid than the fairy tale suggested. Nothing here could be taken for granted, and as if to prove that the pressures came from every direction, that same year would offer Grace a glittering temptation from her old life and force her to choose all over again. That same period brought Grace the most tantalizing offer of her princess years, a chance to act again. Alfred Hitchcock, the director who had adored her, wanted her to star in a new film called Marnie, and for a brief thrilling moment it seemed possible. Grace was interested. Rainier was, at first, open to it. Plans were sketched. And then the reaction came. The people of Monaco balked at the idea of their princess returning to the screen, and the pressure mounted until the dream quietly collapsed. She turned the role down. It was a small door swinging shut, but it closed on something enormous, the last real possibility that she might ever be Grace Kelly the actress again. After Marnie, that part of her life was truly over. To understand how tempting this was, you have to remember who was asking. Hitchcock was not just any director. He was the filmmaker who had drawn out some of her finest work, who understood her particular gifts, who had helped make her a legend in the first place. Their collaboration had been one of the great creative partnerships of her career. So when he came calling with a new project and wanted her at the centre of it, This was not a random offer. This was the one person, from the one part of her old life, most likely to lure her back. And for a genuinely thrilling moment, it looked like it might actually happen. Grace was interested. Of course she was interested. This was the work she loved, offered by the man who knew how to use her best. Rainier, remarkably, was initially open to the idea. Plans took shape. There was talk of how it might be arranged, how the princess could slip back onto a film set without the whole enterprise collapsing under the weight of scandal. For a while, the impossible seemed almost within reach. A princess who was also, once more, an actress. Then reality asserted itself, in the form of public opinion. The people of Monaco did not like the idea, not one bit. The notion of their princess, their dignified symbol, their fairy tale figure, returning to the world of film, of make-believe, of pretending to be other people for money, struck many as unbecoming, even undignified. This was their princess, and princesses did not moonlight as movie stars. The disapproval grew, the pressure mounted, and what had seemed briefly possible began to curdle. Faced with the displeasure of the very country she had given up her career to serve, Grace made the choice she always ultimately made. She turned the role down. Duty won, as duty had been winning since the day she said yes to the prince. The film went ahead without her. Another actress stepped into the part, and Grace remained in her palace, a princess and not an actress, exactly as her role demanded. It sounds like a small thing. One declined film among the many she could have made in another life. But it was not small. It was the last real chance. This was the moment the door to her old identity, which had been standing slightly ajar all these years, finally swung shut and latched. Before Marnie, there was always the faint theoretical possibility that she might someday return to acting. After Marnie, there was not. That part of her, the artist, the performer, the woman who had won an Oscar, was now permanently retired, not by her own free choice, but by the weight of a role that could not tolerate competition. She let it go with grace, as she let everything go. But somewhere behind the poise, a door had closed, and she knew it. And on the other side of that closed door waited something the fairy tale had never advertised: loneliness. Beneath the poise, Grace often ached for home, in ways she rarely let the public see. She missed America, missed her family, missed the easy freedoms of the life she had traded away. The palace, for all its beauty, could feel like a very elegant confinement, its walls lined with duty. She was surrounded by people yet frequently lonely, admired everywhere yet truly known by almost no one. The phrase that would later attach itself to her, the gilded cage, was cruel in its accuracy. She had everything a fairy tale promised and found, as many do, that a life arranged entirely around appearances leaves precious little room for the person living it. She adapted, as she always did. But adapting is not the same as belonging. The homesickness was real and persistent. She was an American, raised in a big American city, shaped by American rhythms and American ease, and she now lived across an ocean in a tiny European principality where everything was foreign, formal, and old. She missed her family, the people who had known her before the crown, who saw Grace rather than the princess. She missed the casual freedoms of her former life, the ability to move through the world without every step being an occasion. The distance was not just geographic. It was a gap between who she had been and who she now had to be, and it did not close with time. The palace, so beautiful in every photograph, could feel from the inside like a beautifully appointed prison. This is the paradox that gave the gilded cage its name. Every luxury imaginable surrounded her, and yet her life was hemmed in on all sides by duty, protocol, and the relentless requirement to perform her role. She could not simply go where she wished, do as she pleased, or be who she felt like being on any given day. Freedom, the ordinary kind, had been the price of the crown, and she had paid it in full without perhaps realizing at the time quite how much it would cost. The loneliness was the sharpest part. She was never physically alone, of course. She was constantly surrounded by staff, courtiers, dignitaries, and the endless parade of people that royal life throws at you. And she was admired, adored even, by millions who felt they knew her intimately from photographs and newsreels. But being surrounded is not the same as being accompanied, and being admired is not the same as being known. The people around her related to the princess, the symbol, the role. The actual woman inside it, with her specific longings and humour and sadness, was known to very few. It is possible to be one of the most famous people alive and still feel that almost no one truly sees you. She adapted, because adapting was what Grace did. She had adapted to Hollywood, to the studio system, to a new language and a foreign court, and now she adapted to this too, building a functional, dignified, outwardly contented life inside the constraints. From the outside, she managed it beautifully. The public saw a woman who had everything and seemed serene in the having of it. But adapting to a cage is not the same as being free in it, and making a life inside constraints is not the same as belonging. She had traded the fullness of her old self for the fairy tale, and the fairy tale, it turned out, had very little room for a whole person. She had gained the world and given up, in exchange, the simple freedom to be entirely herself, and the cage had one more cruelty built into its design. She could never even feel its bars in private, because the cameras never once stopped watching. Grace had traded one kind of fame for another, and the second kind never gave her a day off. As an actress, she had at least been able to step out of the spotlight between films. As a princess, the film never wrapped. The press followed her relentlessly, cataloguing her clothes, her weight, her expressions, her children, her every public appearance. Every outing was a performance, every photograph a potential headline. She managed her image with the skill of the professional she had once been. But the sheer permanence of the scrutiny was something new and exhausting. There was no character to hide behind anymore, no role to retreat into. The role was her, all the time, and the world had appointed itself her permanent audience. Think about the difference between the two kinds of fame. As an actress, however famous, she had worked in projects with beginnings and endings. A film shot wrapped and released, and in the gaps between them there was breathing room, time away from the cameras, stretches where she could simply live. The spotlight was intense but intermittent. You could step out of it, recover, and step back in when the next project called. Fame, for all its pressures, came with intermissions. Royal fame had no intermissions. There was no wrap date, no hiatus, no season finale after which everyone went home. She was the Princess of Monaco every hour of every day for the rest of her life, and the world's interest in her never once let up. The press pursued her with an appetite that never dulled, and everything about her was fair game. Her clothing was analysed, her weight was monitored and remarked upon, her facial expressions were interpreted, her children were photographed. Her every public appearance became material, dissected and reported and judged. This meant that every single outing, no matter how minor, was a performance. Leaving the palace was never just leaving the palace. It was stepping onto a stage where cameras waited and any image captured might become tomorrow's headline. A tired expression, an unflattering angle, a moment of ordinary human imperfection, any of it could be frozen and broadcast and picked over. So she was always composed, always aware, always managing the impression she made because the impression she made was public property. She was, at least, uniquely equipped for this. She had been a professional at exactly this skill, the disciplined management of image, the art of appearing precisely as she wished to appear. Her Hollywood training had made her a master of the camera, and she brought all of it to bear on her royal life. Few people alive could have handled the relentless scrutiny with more polish. But polish is not the same as ease, and even a master gets tired. The truly grinding part was not the difficulty of the performance, it was the permanence of it. As an actress, when the exhaustion set in, she could retreat into a character, hide inside a role, let someone invented carry the weight for a while. As a princess, there was no character to retreat into. The role was not a part she played. It was her own name, her own face, her own self, on display without pause or shelter. The world had cast her in the longest-running production imaginable, with herself as the only possible star, and there would be no final performance. She was always on camera, always the princess, always watched. And the scrutiny was about to grow only more intense, because being beloved, it turned out, was not a state of grace. It was a full-time job with a very demanding schedule. Being a princess, it turned out, was less a life of leisure than a calendar of obligations, and Grace filled hers with genuine purpose. She took on the presidency of the Monaco Red Cross, threw herself into charitable work, and became the gracious centre of the principality's endless round of galas, ceremonies and receptions. Chief among them was the famous Rose Ball, a dazzling social event she helped make a fixture of Monaco's year. To the public it all looked like effortless glamour, one beautiful evening after another. In reality it was work, steady and demanding, the daily business of being beloved on schedule. Grace understood that her warmth was now a national asset, and she spent it generously, whether or not she felt like smiling that night. There is a persistent fantasy that royalty is a life of leisure, of lounging in palaces and being handed grapes. The reality, at least for a conscientious princess, is closer to running a permanent public relations campaign with an itinerary that never empties. Grace's days filled up with duties, appearances and responsibilities, a steady stream of obligations that came with the title whether she was in the mood for them or not. The crown was not a reward you collected. It was a job you clocked into every single morning. Her charitable work was real and substantial. She took on the leadership of the Monaco Red Cross, lending far more than her name, and immersed herself in the causes a princess is expected to champion. This was not ceremonial hand-waving. It meant meetings, planning, appearances, and the genuine labour of steering an organisation and raising its profile. She had a platform of extraordinary visibility, and she used it, turning the world's fascination with her into attention and money for causes that needed both. Then there was the social calendar, that glittering, exhausting parade of galas, ceremonies and receptions that formed the connective tissue of Monaco's public life. As princess, she was the gracious centre of all of it, the hostess, the honoured guest, the radiant presence that made each event feel like an occasion. The crown jewel of this social season was the celebrated Rose Ball, a spectacular annual gathering she helped elevate into one of the fixtures of Monaco's year, a night of flowers and elegance and international glamour that became inseparable from her image. To everyone watching, it looked like the easiest thing in the world. Beautiful woman, beautiful gowns, beautiful evenings, one after another, an unending stream of champagne and chandeliers. Who could call that work? But that is precisely the illusion that made her so good at the job, being consistently, flawlessly gracious, across an endless schedule of events is genuinely demanding. The sort of thing that looks effortless only because a professional is making it look that way. Behind every serene appearance was preparation, stamina, and the discipline to perform warmth on command. Because that was the real assignment underneath all of it. Grace understood, with her usual clarity, that her charm and warmth were no longer merely personal traits. They were national assets, resources the principality depended on. Her graciousness drew the world's affection to Monaco, and that affection had real value. So she spent it generously, deliberately, night after night, being beloved on schedule, radiating warmth at galas, whether her feet hurt, whether she was homesick, whether she felt like it at all. It was the business of being adored, and she ran it well. But even the most dutiful princess needs somewhere to put the parts of herself the galas had no use for. And Grace found that somewhere in the world of art. Denied the stage and screen, Grace poured her creative hunger into becoming a champion of the arts. And here she found something close to genuine fulfillment. She supported dance, theatre, and the artistic life of Monaco with real devotion, lending her name, her time, and her considerable influence to nurturing the work of others. If she could no longer perform, she could at least ensure that beautiful things were made and seen. This patronage became one of the most meaningful threads of her later princess years, and would outlast her in the foundations and programs built around her name. It was, in a quiet way, her means of keeping one foot in the artistic world she had loved and been forced to leave behind. The hunger did not go away just because the career did. Grace was an artist by temperament, a person drawn to performance, beauty, and creative expression, and giving up acting did not remove that part of her. It simply left it without an outlet. You cannot spend your formative years as a celebrated performer and then have the creative impulse politely evaporate on your wedding day. It stays with you, restless, looking for somewhere to go. She found its destination in patronage. If she could no longer stand in the spotlight herself, she could become the person who made the spotlight possible for others. She threw herself into supporting the arts, particularly dance and theatre, championing performers and companies, and the broader cultural life of Monaco. She lent these causes the three things she had in abundance: her name, which opened any door in the world, her time, which she gave generously, and her influence, which could turn a struggling artistic venture into a celebrated one almost overnight. This was more than a hobby or a ceremonial duty. It was by many accounts one of the genuinely fulfilling parts of her later princess years, a place where the old creative fire could still burn, just redirected. There is a particular satisfaction in nurturing other people's talent, in being the reason a dancer gets to dance or a play gets to be staged, and Grace seems to have found real meaning in it. It let her stay connected to the world she loved, the world of artists and performances and made beauty, even though she could no longer be a maker within it herself. In a sense, it was the closest thing she could get to going home. The film industry had been her true country, the place where she had been most fully herself, and marriage had exiled her from it. Patronage was how she visited, surrounding herself with artists, supporting their work, immersing herself in the life of the theatre and the dance. She got to keep one foot on familiar ground. She could not perform, but she could belong at the edges to the creative world that had shaped her. And this devotion left a lasting mark. The foundations and programs built around her name, dedicated to supporting emerging artists, would carry this passion forward long after she was gone, turning her personal longing into a lasting engine of support for others. What began as one woman's redirected creative hunger became an institution, a legacy of patronage that outlived her by decades. So the arts became her refuge, her contribution, and her quiet act of remaining herself. But there were even smaller, more private refuges she kept for herself alone, hobbies the tabloids never bothered to photograph, and it was there, in the unwatched corners, that the real Grace could finally exhale. In the private corners of her life, Grace cultivated passions that were entirely her own, small rebellions against a world that scheduled everything else. She became devoted to pressed flowers, creating intricate botanical collages, and she found real joy in poetry, gardens, and the natural world. These were not the pursuits the tabloids cared about, which was precisely their appeal. They were hers, unwatched and unjudged. A way of making something with her own hands that no committee had to approve. In a life defined by public expectation, these quiet hobbies were where the actual Grace, curious and creative and a little unconventional, was allowed to exist. Every fairy tale princess needs a room the story doesn't reach. These were hers. Of all her interests, the pressed flowers are perhaps the most telling and the most quietly charming. She developed a genuine devotion to the craft, gathering blossoms and leaves and pressing them, then arranging the delicate, preserved fragments into intricate collages, small works of art made from bits of the natural world. It was patient, meticulous work, the sort of thing that requires stillness and attention, and produces nothing more grand than a beautiful arrangement of dried petals. And that was exactly the point. In a life crowded with grand occasions, here was something modest, tactile, and entirely her own. She loved poetry too, and gardens, and the natural world in general, the growing, unglamorous, unposed reality of living things. These were the interests of a person seeking texture and quiet, a counterweight to the polished formality that governed everything else. There is something almost poignant in the image of one of the most photographed women alive spending her private hours bent over pressed petals or lost in a book of verse, seeking in those small pleasures the ordinary human satisfaction her extraordinary life so rarely allowed. What made these hobbies precious was precisely what made them invisible. The tabloids did not care about pressed flowers. There was no headline in a botanical collage, no scandal in a love of poetry. The press hungered for glamour, drama, and spectacle, and these gentle pursuits offered none of it, which is exactly why they belonged to her and no one else. In a life where nearly everything was public property, here at last were things the cameras had no interest in, corners of her existence that remained genuinely private. They were, in a small way, acts of rebellion. Everything else in her life was scheduled, judged, and performed for an audience, but these were hers alone, made with her own hands, answerable to no committee, subject to no protocol, requiring no one's approval. She did not press flowers because a princess ought to. She pressed them because she wanted to. In a world that had claimed nearly every other part of her, the assertion of a purely personal pleasure was its own quiet declaration of independence, and in those unwatched hours, the real Grace could exist. Not the flawless princess, not the radiant symbol, not the gracious hostess performing warmth on schedule, but the actual woman underneath, curious, creative, drawn to beauty and quiet and the patient making of small lovely things. She was, it turns out, a little unconventional, a person of genuine and specific tastes that had nothing to do with crowns. Every fairy tale princess, it seems, needs a room the story cannot reach, a place where she gets to simply be herself. Pressed flowers and poetry were Grace's, but the world had a way of turning even her most casual choices into legend, and one of them would attach her name to an object carried by strangers for generations to come. Grace's influence on the world of style was so profound that it produced one of the most enduring artifacts of 20th century fashion, an object that still bears her name today. A structured leather handbag from the French house, Hermes became so associated with her after she was famously photographed using one to shield herself from the press that it was eventually renamed in her honour, the Kelly bag. It is a small, strange kind of immortality that a woman who won an Oscar and married a prince should also be remembered every time someone reaches for a particular purse. But it speaks to how completely Grace embodied a certain ideal of elegance. She did not just wear fashion, she became a permanent reference point for it. The story behind the bag is almost too perfect. The House of Hermes made a particular structured leather handbag, elegant and refined, the sort of accessory that already had its admirers. Grace favoured it, carried it, made it part of her look, and then, in one of those accidental moments that outlive their creators, she was photographed using the bag to shield herself, holding it up in some tellings, to conceal or protect herself from the ever-present cameras. The image circulated, the association stuck, and the bag she'd used to hide from the press became forever linked to the most photographed woman alive. So indelible was that link that the company eventually renamed the bag in her honour. What had been simply a fine handbag became the Kelly bag, christened after the princess who had made it famous, and it has carried that name ever since. Decades later, it remains one of the most coveted and iconic objects in the world of fashion, sought after, imitated, and instantly recognisable, its name a permanent little monument to a woman most of its owners never met. There is something genuinely strange about this particular form of fame. Grace Kelly achieved a great deal. She won the highest honour in her profession. She married into one of Europe's oldest royal houses. She secured a dynasty, championed the arts, and charmed the entire world. And yet one of the ways she is most enduringly remembered, encountered daily by people who could not name a single one of her films, is through a purse. Every time someone reaches for a Kelly bag, they are, without necessarily knowing it, invoking her. But look past the oddity of it, and the bag reveals something real about who she was in the world's imagination. It did not get named after her by accident of marketing. It got named after her because she so completely embodied a specific ideal, a cool, refined, effortless elegance that the whole culture recognized and aspired to. She was not merely a woman who wore beautiful things. She was the standard against which beautiful things were measured, the reference point, the definition of a certain kind of grace, in every sense of that word. That is a rare kind of influence. Plenty of famous people are admired. Very few become the permanent yardstick for an entire aesthetic, the name a fashion house reaches for when it wants to say timeless and elegant in a single word. Grace crossed that line. She did not just participate in style, she became one of its fixed stars, a point of orientation that fashion still navigates by. An Oscar, a crown, a dynasty, and a handbag. It is a genuinely peculiar list of legacies, and it belonged to a woman whose family, meanwhile, was still growing, with one more child yet to arrive. In 1965, after several years, Grace gave birth to a third and final child, a second daughter named Stephanie, and the arrival brought a softer, warmer energy to the family. With the pressures of succession long since satisfied, this was motherhood freed from national duty, and Grace embraced it. By now she'd settled more fully into her life, more sure of herself, more at ease in her adopted world even as she still guarded her private longings. The 3 Grimaldi children became one of the great focuses of her heart. Whatever the palace had failed to give her in freedom, her family gave her in meaning, and she was, above all the titles, a deeply devoted and attentive mother. The gap in timing matters here. Caroline and Albert had arrived in quick succession, back to back, in the frantic early years when the dynasty needed continuity, and the whole country was watching Grace's every pregnancy for signs of the future. Stephanie came years later, well after all of that pressure had been resolved, and that difference changed everything about the experience. This was not a birth the nation was anxiously awaiting to secure a throne. This was simply a family welcoming a new child for no reason other than love, that freed the whole thing of its old weight. When Caroline was born, there had been joy shadowed by the unfinished business of the succession. When Albert arrived, there had been relief, cannons, the exhale of a secured dynasty. But Stephanie was born into none of that. The heir was long since in place, the future assured, the obligations met. So her arrival could be pure, uncomplicated happiness, motherhood experienced not as a matter of state, but as a private blessing. For once, Grace got to have a baby simply because she was a mother, not because she was a princess with the duty to perform, and she was, by this point, a different woman than the anxious newcomer of a decade earlier. The years had settled her. She had mastered the language, the customs, the endless demands of her role. She'd grown more sure of herself, more comfortable in her adopted world, even as she continued to guard the private longings that had never fully faded. The rawness of those first overwhelming years had given way to something steadier. She knew who she was in this life now, and she could meet a new child from a place of confidence rather than fear. Motherhood, in fact, became one of the great anchors of her existence. The 3 Grimaldi children were among the deepest focuses of her heart, the part of her royal life that felt least like performance and most like truth. Whatever the palace had failed to provide, whatever freedoms the crown had cost her, her children gave her something the fairy tale could not: genuine, unscripted meaning. In the nursery and around the family table, she was not a symbol or a national asset. She was simply their mother, and she was, by every account, a devoted and attentive one, deeply involved in her children's lives in a way that mattered enormously to her. Above all the titles and honours and glittering obligations, this was perhaps the identity she held most dearly. She'd given up a great deal to become a princess. In her children, she found a reason that made the whole strange bargain feel worthwhile. But raising royal children, especially with the fierce, hands-on instincts of an American mother, would prove to be its own complicated adventure, one that did not always go according to plan. Raising royal children in a European court, as an American mother with distinctly American instincts, was its own delicate balancing act. Grace wanted her children to have a groundedness she feared the palace might rob from them, and she could be notably firm, protective, and hands-on in an environment that expected royal offspring to be handed largely to staff. She worried about the effects of privilege, tried to instill discipline and normalcy, and fretted over their futures as only a parent can. But she was also raising them inside a fishbowl, where their every stumble would someday be public. The tension between the ordinary mother she wanted to be and the extraordinary exposed lives her children were born into would follow all of them for years. The clash of cultures was built into the situation. European royal tradition had well-established ideas about how princes and princesses were raised, which involved a great deal of delegation to nannies, tutors, and staff, a certain formal distance between royal parents and their children. Grace, an American shaped by different instincts, wanted something more hands-on, more involved, more like the engaged parenting she believed in. She was not content to hand her children off to be raised by others and see them at appointed intervals. She wanted to be in it, present and active, in a way that did not entirely match the customs of the court. Underneath that was a real and specific fear that the palace would ruin her children. She worried about the corrosive effects of privilege, the way extraordinary wealth and status can hollow out a young person, breeding entitlement and detachment from reality. She had, after all, grown up in a demanding household where achievement was expected, and nothing was simply handed to you, and some part of her wanted her children to have that same groundedness, that same understanding that the world did not exist purely to serve them. So she pushed for discipline, for normalcy, for a sense of proportion, trying to raise decent, well-anchored human beings inside one of the most rarefied environments on Earth. This made her, by the standards of her surroundings, a notably firm and protective mother. She was involved, watchful, and unafraid to set boundaries, fretting over her children's development and their futures with the ordinary intensity of any devoted parent. In this she was deeply relatable. Strip away the palace, and you have a mother worrying about spoiling her kids, trying to instill good values, anxious about how they will turn out. It is one of the most universal struggles there is, just conducted in a castle. But there was a cruelty in the setup that no amount of good parenting could solve. She was raising these children in a fishbowl. Every choice they made, every stumble, every rebellion, every mistake of growing up would eventually be public, dissected by the same relentless press that had spent years cataloguing her own weight and wardrobe. Normal children get to make their errors in private, to be awkward and foolish and reckless without an audience. Her children did not have that luxury. Their coming of age would be a spectator sport. So the tension was permanent and unresolvable. Grace wanted to raise ordinary, grounded, well-adjusted people, and she was trying to do it inside a life that was anything but ordinary, where privacy did not exist and the whole world felt entitled to watch. The gap between the mother she wanted to be and the exposed, extraordinary lives her children had been born into would shadow the whole family. And as her daughters grew into young women with wills of their own, that gap would widen into something the tabloids could hardly wait to photograph. As Caroline and Stephanie grew into young women, they proved to have wills every bit as strong as their mothers, and their teenage and early adult years brought the kind of headlines that no amount of palace polish could prevent. There were relationships the family disapproved of, rebellions large and small, and a hungry press eager to document every one of them. Grace, who had spent her life mastering the art of controlling her own image, discovered the humbling limits of controlling anyone else's, especially her own daughters. It was a familiar heartbreak dressed in extraordinary circumstances, a mother watching her children insist on making their own mistakes, in her case with the whole world keeping score. It should not have been a surprise. Grace herself had been a strong-willed young woman who defied her family's expectations, who chose a scandalous profession over their disapproval and then triumphed at it. Rebellion and independence were, in a sense, the family inheritance. So when her daughters grew up with fierce wills of their own, insisting on their own choices and their own lives, they were being, in the most direct way, their mother's daughters. The apple, as it usually does, landed near the tree, but an independent streak that looks admirable in hindsight is considerably harder to live with in the moment, especially in a family whose every move is public. The daughters entered relationships the family did not approve of, made choices that raised palace eyebrows, and generally refused to remain the picture-perfect royal children the fairy tale demanded. There were rebellions of every size, romances that alarmed their parents, the ordinary turbulence of young people finding their own way, except conducted under the most intense scrutiny imaginable. And the press, of course, was ravenous for all of it. If the world had spent decades fascinated by Grace, it was every bit as fascinated by her children, and it documented their every relationship, misstep, and act of defiance with relentless appetite. A daughter's questionable romance was not a private family concern to be worked out quietly. It was international news, splashed across publications, dissected by strangers, replayed endlessly. The children's growing pains became public entertainment. For Grace, this was a peculiar and humbling reversal. She had spent her entire adult life as a master of image control. First, as an actress trained to present exactly the face she chose, then as a princess who managed her public self with flawless discipline. Controlling how the world saw her was perhaps her single greatest skill. But she now discovered its absolute limit. You cannot control anyone else, and least of all your own children. All the poise and technique in the world could not make her daughters behave as the fairy tale required. They were their own people, and they insisted on it. So she faced the oldest heartbreak in parenting, the one that has nothing to do with crowns. She had to watch her children make their own choices, including the ones she believed were mistakes, and she had to accept that she could not save them from themselves. Every parent eventually confronts this. The moment you realize your children are separate people who will live their own lives and learn their own hard lessons regardless of your wishes. Grace confronted it like anyone else, except that her version played out on the front pages, with the whole world keeping score of her family's every stumble. It was, beneath the extraordinary circumstances, profoundly ordinary. A mother loving children she could no longer protect or direct. And through all of it, another quiet pressure was steadily mounting, one aimed not at her daughters but at Grace herself, and at the very thing that had made her famous in the first place. Grace had become famous for a very particular kind of youthful, cool blonde beauty, and time, as it does to everyone, eventually asked her to let that image go in full public view. She aged, her figure changed, and the same press that had once worshipped her flawlessness now noted every alteration with unkind attention. For a woman whose entire public identity had been built on being looked at, this was a uniquely difficult passage. She faced it with more grace than most, leaning into her interests, her family, and her work rather than the mirror. But the pressure of having grown up and grown older as a living symbol of perfection was real, and it took a quiet toll that the smiling photographs never showed. The trap was set the moment she became famous. Grace had built her entire public identity on a specific luminous image, the cool, flawless, youthful blonde, the very definition of a certain kind of beauty. That image was her signature, the thing the world adored and expected. But an image frozen at its peak is a debt that time always comes to collect. You cannot stay 26 forever, and the more completely your fame rests on youthful perfection, the more brutal the reckoning when the years inevitably arrive. And arrive they did, as they do for every human being who has ever lived. Grace aged. Her figure changed. The face and body that had once been held up as the standard of perfection became simply older, in the ordinary universal way. There is nothing remarkable about this. It is the most common experience on Earth. What was uncommon was the audience. Most people get to grow older in relative privacy, their changes noticed only by the people around them. Grace grew older in front of the entire world, with cameras trained on her the whole way. The same press that had once worshipped her turned, as the press does, to noting every change with unkind attention. The publications that had built her up as the paragon of flawless beauty now catalogued her weight, her aging, every departure from the impossible standard they themselves had established. It is a special cruelty to be adored for your youth and then punished for losing it, as though growing older were a failure of will rather than the basic condition of being alive. Grace, who had spent decades being looked at, now had to endure being looked at critically, measured against a version of herself that no longer existed and never could have lasted. For someone whose whole life had been organized around appearance, this was a genuinely difficult passage. Her beauty had been her calling card, her armor, her currency, and watching the world respond to its natural fading struck at something central. This was not vanity. It was the disorientation of a person whose public self had been so bound up with being beautiful that its inevitable change felt like a kind of loss. But she met it, characteristically with more grace than most could have managed. Rather than waging a desperate, doomed war against time, she leaned into the things that did not depend on a youthful face: her interests, her pressed flowers and poetry, her family, her work in the arts. She found her worth in what she did and who she loved rather than in the mirror, redirecting her sense of self toward more durable ground. It was a quietly wise response to an impossible situation. Still, the toll was real, even if the smiling photographs never showed it. She carried the private weight of having grown older as a living monument to perfection, and no one carries that lightly. She was, in her final years, learning to be someone the fairy tale had never imagined. Not the flawless young princess, but a fuller, deeper, aging woman. And she was doing it with quiet dignity, right up until the ordinary afternoon that ended everything. On the 13th of September, 1982, Grace was driving down the steep, winding mountain roads above Monaco with her youngest daughter Stephanie in the passenger seat. Somewhere along that treacherous corniche, something went catastrophically wrong. The car left the road and plunged down a steep embankment. Stephanie survived. Grace, gravely injured, did not. She died the following day, at just 52 years old. It is now widely believed she may have suffered a stroke at the wheel, a small, invisible failure of the body that ended one of the most watched lives of the century in an instant. The fairy tale did not fade out gently. It ended suddenly, on an ordinary road, on an ordinary afternoon, the way real lives so often and so cruelly do. There was nothing momentous about the morning. She was simply driving, making the trip down from the family's country retreat in the hills back toward Monaco, with her teenage daughter beside her. It was the sort of routine journey she'd surely made countless times, along roads she knew, on a day like any other. This is how catastrophe usually arrives, not with warning or ceremony, but disguised as an ordinary errand on an ordinary afternoon. The roads themselves were genuinely treacherous, steep and serpentine, carved into the mountainside above the principality with sharp turns and unforgiving drops. These were the famous winding corniches of the region, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, the kind of roads that demand full attention and punish any lapse severely. Somewhere along that descent, in a moment no one fully witnessed, control was lost, and the car left the road and went over the edge, plunging down a steep embankment. Stephanie in the passenger seat survived. She was injured, but she lived. Grace did not. Gravely hurt in the crash, she died the following day, on the 14th of September, at just 52 years old. A life that had been watched by more people than almost any other in the century ended in a hospital bed, the result of a single catastrophic afternoon on a mountain road. What makes it especially haunting is the growing belief about the cause. It is widely thought that Grace may have suffered a stroke while driving, a sudden, invisible failure inside her own body that took the decision entirely out of her hands. If so, then the accident was not really an accident of driving at all, but the external consequence of something silent going wrong within her, a tiny biological betrayal that steered a woman who had controlled everything about her public life straight off a road she knew well. There is a terrible irony in it, that a life defined by control ended through a loss of control she could not possibly have prevented. And so the fairy tale did not receive the ending fairy tales are supposed to get. There was no gentle fade, no peaceful conclusion after a long full life, no soft closing chapter. There was a sudden, violent, senseless accident on an ordinary road, and a woman gone at 52, decades before her time. It was not the death of a legend. It was the death of a person, abrupt and unfair, the way real deaths so often are. The world, which had watched her wedding by the tens of millions and followed her every move for decades, now received the news it could scarcely believe. The princess was gone. The beautiful, disciplined, complicated woman who had given up a career to become a symbol had died as anyone might, on a road, on an afternoon, without warning. And the morning that followed would show just how deeply she had lodged herself in the imagination of the entire world. Grace's funeral drew the world's grief to that same little cathedral where she had married, and the mourning was genuine and global. She was buried in the Grimaldi family vault, in the country she had given up everything to serve. But her story refused to end there. In the decades since, Grace Kelly has only grown larger in the imagination, remembered as both the radiant movie star and the elegant, dutiful, quietly complicated princess. Her legacy lives on in foundations, in fashion, in film retrospectives, and in the enduring myth of the girl who married a prince. Tonight, though, we've tried to look past the myth to the woman inside it, talented, disciplined, homesick, devoted, and human. The fairy tale, it turns out, was always the least interesting thing about her. The symmetry of the ending is almost unbearably poignant. She was laid to rest with a funeral held in the very same cathedral where, some 26 years earlier, she had stood in her legendary lace gown and married her prince before 30 million watching eyes. The building that had hosted the beginning of the fairy tale now hosted its end. The same stones that had witnessed the wedding of the century witnessed the grief of a world that had, against all reason, come to feel it knew her. And the grief was genuine, not the manufactured mourning of celebrity, but something deeper and more widespread. People who had never met her felt the loss personally, because she had been a fixture of the collective imagination for so long, a presence woven into the culture of an entire era. She was buried in the Grimaldi family vault, taking her permanent place among the ancient dynasty she had joined, in the small country she'd given up her career, her freedom, and ultimately her old self to serve. She had become, fully and finally, a Grimaldi. But death did not shrink her. If anything, it did the opposite. In the decades since, Grace Kelly has only grown larger in the world's imagination, occupying a rare double throne in memory. Forever the radiant Hollywood star of her films, and forever the elegant, dutiful, quietly complicated princess of her second life. Most people are remembered, if at all, for one thing. She is remembered vividly for 2 entire lives, each of them extraordinary, joined at the improbable hinge of a fairy tale wedding. Her legacy runs in many channels. It lives in the foundations that carry her name and continue her devotion to nurturing artists. It lives in fashion, in the bag that still bears her name and the timeless elegance she came to define. It lives in the film retrospectives that keep her performances alive for new generations who discover, often with surprise, just how good she actually was. And above all, it lives in the enduring myth itself, the story of the beautiful American girl who married a European prince, which remains one of the most powerful fairy tales the modern world ever told itself. Yet the myth, for all its staying power, was always the shallowest version of her. Tonight we've tried to reach past it, to find the actual woman inside the story. Talented and disciplined, yes, but also homesick, lonely, fiercely devoted to her children, quietly rebellious in her pressed flowers and poetry, aging with difficulty under an unforgiving gaze, and above everything else, human. Not a symbol, not a postcard, a person. Because that is the real revelation at the heart of her life. The fairy tale was lovely, and it was famous, and it was, in the end, the least interesting thing about her. The interesting thing was the woman who lived inside it, and everything the storybook left out. So that was the fairy tale, with all the soft focus quietly wiped away. A young woman at the very top of her world who gave up the career she'd fought for, crossed an ocean, learned a new language, and folded herself into an ancient dynasty on a small rock above the sea. She traded applause for duty, freedom for a crown, and the simple pleasure of an unwatched afternoon for a lifetime of being looked at. She learned to be flawless in a foreign court, secured a throne, charmed a suspicious world, and raised her children inside a fishbowl, all while quietly aching for a home she could never quite return to. And through all of it, she endured with a grace that went far beyond her name. She found small refuges where she could, in pressed flowers and poetry, in the arts she loved, in the family she adored. She carried loneliness with dignity and answered an impossible role with quiet, stubborn resilience, night after night, gala after gala, smile after smile. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, in your own quiet room, with the simple, unglamorous freedom to be entirely yourself, unwatched and unjudged, maybe spare a gentle thought for the woman behind the tiara. Not the postcard, not the myth, but the real person who reminds us that even the most golden life has its heavy hours, and that being ordinary and free is its own kind of treasure. Because in the end, the fairy tale was never the point. The person inside it was. Rest easy now. Let the palace lights dim, let the cameras fall silent, and let the winding roads and the glittering sea fade softly into the dark. Sleep well. We will be here again tomorrow night, with another story to carry you gently away.